At the end of the Third Crusade, Richard the Lionheart pointed the finger of blame at one man for the Crusaders' failure to recapture Jerusalem. The man he held responsible was Philip II of France, who had once been Richard's ally during his rebellion against his father, the now dead Henry II. Richard said furiously that if it had not been for his, Philip's, malice, forcing me to return, I would have been able to recover the whole of Outremer. Richard's mood had not been helped by a bout of serious illness, which was another factor in his decision to not launch an assault on Jerusalem, aside from the dwindling numbers of his army, and worse was to come following the crusade. On his return to the west, Richard was ambushed by Duke Leopold of Austria, who eventually handed the king over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. For his part in these shocking events, Leopold was excommunicated, but it is doubtful whether he cared all that much. Ingratiating himself with the emperor and earning handsomely for his efforts would have been enough compensation for Leopold. When Richard was eventually released in early 1194, well over a year since his capture, a huge ransom had been agreed and Leopold would get a share. In England, these events would have been profoundly disturbing. Richard had only been king for a short time before he left for his crusade, and now he would be kept away from his kingdom for God only knew how long, despite his best efforts to ensure his Ashanvine empire was still correctly governed, even whilst he was being detained against his will. However, the person who felt the burden of Richard's imprisonment more than any other was his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor herself had spent 15 years a prisoner, and one of Richard's first acts as king was to release his mother, with whom he'd always been especially close. Now the time had come for Eleanor to reciprocate. Eleanor, with seemingly endless energy for a woman approaching 70, devoted herself to securing Richard's release, as well as helping to raise the enormous ransom. Eleanor wrote 3 times to Pope Celestine III, beseeching him to do all he could to ensure the king was freed from captivity. She wrote emotionally, calling herself a suffering mother and referring to her violent grief. In her first letter to Celestine, Eleanor started with some flattery, calling the Pope the Prince of Priests. However, in closing, Eleanor became more critical of Celestine. She accused him of being indecisive and the Church slow in its efforts to secure Richard's liberation. She continued, "The Church will blush, not without tears, that it did not help or recognize such a son, Richard, in such anguish." However, Celestine failed to cover himself in glory. Although he pointedly refused to recognize Henry's status as emperor, he failed to excommunicate him, rather undermining his own authority. In her second letter to Pope Celestine, Eleanor continued to beg him to act against the emperor, whom she referred to as the tyrant. She even referred back to Henry II, with whom she'd had such a spectacular falling out, and his efforts to make amends with the papacy after the disastrous murder of Thomas Becket in 1170. Eleanor was putting all her skills into practice. Having gone from almost chastising the Pope, she was now employing a form of emotional blackmail. Eleanor had a remarkable political guile, and she was demonstrating that to the fullest. All the while, Richard remained frustrated yet unbowed, a prisoner of the Emperor. After his release, Richard again would turn his wrath on Philip, stating, "When I was in prison, he, Philip, conspired to keep me there, so that he could steal my lands." However, Philip was not the only one who hoped to see Richard indefinitely remain in his predicament. Richard's brother John, the youngest child of Henry II and Eleanor, allied himself with Philip, hoping to seize power in Richard's absence. On Richard's release, Philip warned John, "Look to yourself. the devil is loose. As it happened, John had little to fear on his brother's return. Richard inexplicably forgave John, calling him just a child, even though John was aged 27. Richard obviously recognized John's immaturity, even as a grown man, which makes his decision to designate John his heir in 1199 all the more perplexing. In her third and final letter to Pope Celestine, Eleanor became even more despairing of the situation, bemoaning the death of her two adult sons, another Henry and Geoffrey, the plight of Richard, and the behaviour of John. And Eleanor was heavily critical of John, saying, "He depletes the kingdom with his sword and lays it waste with fire." However, Eleanor was not feeling sorry for herself. These were tactics to put further pressure on the Pope. In England, the government was doing all it could to raise the money required to secure Richard's release. Heavy taxes were imposed, and church property of gold and silver was taken by force. Evidently, there was no room for scruples in this time of national emergency. Eventually, Richard would once again be a free man, although, famously, he barely set another foot in England, preoccupied as he was in his war against Philip, which now had a distinctly personal edge to it. The king would have been extremely thankful for the efforts made on his behalf by his mother. When he lay dying in the spring of 1199, after being wounded during a siege, Richard looked towards Eleanor, who was sat beside him, about to witness the death of another of her sons. It would be her, Richard expected, that would help John to govern England correctly. However, Eleanor would not live forever, as formidable as she undoubtedly was. She did her best to assist John in the early years of his reign, but her death in 1204 was another event in a very bad year for the king. In 1204, John lost Normandy and his empire disintegrated, and his reign will be a disaster thereafter. Quite why Richard ignored John's behaviour whilst he was in captivity is something of a puzzlement. He and John had a nephew, albeit a young one, Arthur, who surely couldn't have made a worse king than John. And what's more, Arthur ranked higher in the line of succession.